Back-breaking labor, grueling living conditions, and terrifying punishments were some of the conditions faced by enslaved Africans in the American South. Taken from Africa against their will, treated like cattle and sold like property, these slaves lived brutal lives. By the mid-19th century, 2 million slaves worked on over 74,000 cotton plantations in the United States. Welcome to Bizarre History. Today we're going to look at a day in the life of a slave on a cotton plantation. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, 10 to 12 million slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade. These poor souls were torn from their homes, bought and sold as slaves by other human beings. Crammed into overcrowded slave ships and treated worse than animals, the slaves endured unimaginably horrifying conditions on the 21 to 90-day voyage to the New World. Ripped away from their families and brought on board ships, they were stripped, chained by ankle irons, branded with a hot iron, and sent below deck. They were stacked side by side in a slave deck often just a few feet high. Slaves were forced to live in horribly tight and unsanitary conditions. Many slaves died due to suffocation, malnutrition, and disease. The torture and murder of the slaves by the crew was also common. Slaves that fell ill or were injured were often thrown overboard by the ship's captain. In such nightmarish conditions, suicide was common, and the filth, fear, and closeness drove many to madness. The death toll on these slave ships was so high that the Portuguese called them floating tombs. When the slaves arrived at the New World, they were exchanged for sugar or tobacco and bought by white masters who forced them to work on their plantations. From sunrise to sundown, the slaves toiled in the fields beneath the scorching southern sun. As soon as it was light, they were out in the fields, plowing, hoeing, or harvesting cotton, depending on the time of year. They weren't allowed to stop until noon, when they were permitted a short 10 to 15-minute break. Then it was immediately back to their hard labor, and if a slave's master caught them slacking, they would whip them as punishment. They worked all day until it was too dark to see, and didn't dare stop even for dinner, until the overseer said that their day's work was done. But even at dark, their work wasn't over. The slaves still had chores like chopping wood and feeding animals. They worked by candlelight, and when at last they were done, they fell into bed exhausted for a short sleep before rising and beginning it all again the next day. There was no escape from the never-ending cycle of labor. 6 days a week, slaves were forced to toil, with only the mercy of Sunday off for rest. No one was spared, whether young or old, strong or disabled. Strong slaves were put to work in the field, while the elderly and disabled were subjected to grueling tasks, such as spinning cotton, weaving cloth, and making clothes for hours on end. However, slaves resisted their mistreatment. They worked at a slower pace, disabled machinery, pretended to be sick, and destroyed crops. They argued and fought with their masters and overseers, and many stole livestock, food, or valuables. Some learned to read and write, despite it being forbidden by law. Others burned forests and buildings, or killed their masters using weapons or poison. Some slaves even committed suicide or mutilated themselves to reduce their value as property. Through subtle and overt actions, enslaved African Americans found ways to undermine the oppressive system in which they lived. A former slave, Solomon Northrop, wrote about his first-hand experience in his book, 12 Years a Slave. Quote, "The day's work over in the field, the baskets are toted or carried to the gin house, where cotton is weighed. No matter how fatigued and weary he may be, no matter how much he longs for sleep and rest, a slave never approaches the gin house with his basket of cotton, but with fear. If it falls short in weight, if he has not performed the full task appointed him, he knows that he must suffer. and if he has exceeded it by 10 or 20 pounds, in all probability his master will measure the next day's task accordingly. So, whether he has too little or too much, his approach to the gin house is always with fear and trembling. Most frequently, they have too little, and therefore it is that they are not anxious to leave the field. After weighing, following the whippings, and then the baskets are carried to the cotton house." End quote. The master paid an overseer to watch the slaves, which ensured they worked as hard as possible, and punished them if they didn't do their work well enough. Sometimes the overseer would be benevolent, other times incredibly cruel. Slaves worked under the scourge of his whip. If they didn't pick the required amount of cotton or were caught lagging during the day, they were whipped. Constant fear was their daily reality. The flogging was incredibly painful and would tear through the slave's skin, leaving deep gashes crisscrossing across their backs. Slaves could also be punished for not working hard enough, resisting slavery, which many did, stealing, using their native language, murder, talking too much, or trying to run away. Flogging was not the only method of punishment. Some slaves were put in shackles, others were hung up and left to die. Some were mutilated, having ears slashed off or their eyes gouged out. Others were branded with hot irons. A system of laws called the slave codes controlled slaves' lives and what the master could do and couldn't do to them. Slaves had no rights whatsoever, and the masters could do with them pretty much whatever they liked. Masters sought to have total control over the slaves and demanded total submission from them. In 1831, a black preacher named Nate Turner led the only sustained slave revolt in American history. Over a period of 2 days, 60 whites, including men, women, and children, were killed by blacks. The insurgents were crushed by the state militia and were captured, tried, and killed, and many innocent slaves were interrogated and also killed. Some of them were tortured by having their feet held in a fire. One slave almost had his foot burned off before his interrogator found he was innocent. Turner managed to evade capture for 2 months, but was eventually captured, tried, and hanged. Nate Turner's revolt caused a fear of slaves among the whites and set in motion a new set of legislations that further suppressed black religion, limited the rights of free blacks, and further prohibited the movement, education, and assembly of slaves. Slaves lived in sparse and uncomfortable living quarters, tiny huts or sheds made of rough logs or boards, with no floors but the bare dirt, few windows, and no furniture. Often 2 families shared one hut, but there was no sense of refinement or decency whatever. Some huts had a partition in them to create rooms, while others did not. Men and women often slept together in the same room, curled up on the floor. Their beds were a plank of wood or collections of old rags and straw thrown down in the corners. They only had one coarse blanket to keep them warm. The huts were often poorly constructed, so the rain and snow blew through the cracks and the moisture turned the dirt floor into mud. In dwellings like these, the slaves slept by night and ate by day, where babies were born and the sick were neglected. Slaves rose early and went to bed late, often sitting up late at night to mend clothes or prepare the next day's meal. If they overslept in the mornings, they were whipped. Domestic slaves lived in better conditions, in the home of their master and mistress. Among the slave population, house slaves were considered privileged. Instead of working out in the field, they worked in the home doing chores such as cooking, gardening, running errands, sewing, and repairing clothes for the master's family, caring for domestic animals, household chores, and caring for the master's children. They worked long hours and organized their lives around the needs of the master's family. Interacting with the field slaves was forbidden. If they did so, they were threatened with flogging. They lived harsh and demeaning lives. Abuse was common, and the women house slaves were often raped by their masters. After the United States banned the import of slaves in 1808, the supply of slaves in the country became limited. At the same time, the cotton gin made it possible to grow short staple cotton on more land in the Deep South, especially in the Black Belt region. This led to a high demand for labor, which was met by expanding the internal slave market and bringing more slaves from the Upper South, where farming had become less labor-intensive. Some slave owners also increased the number of slaves by incentivizing their female slaves to have more children, who could then be sold as slaves. It was not uncommon for an enslaved woman to be given her freedom should she bear 15 children. The reality was a child as young as 12 to 13 could be forced into pregnancy to have a child that would be taken from her and forced into slavery. These breeding farms were focused on producing as many slaves as possible for sale and distribution throughout the South. Louisville, Kentucky, and New Orleans were major markets for buying and selling slaves. New Orleans, in particular, became a major port for shipping slaves down the Mississippi River and a major center for the slave trade and related businesses. Leave a note below telling us what weird and dark topic of history you would like us to cover next. As always, thanks for watching Bizarre History. We will see you next time.